I want to say it was about 2018, and I received an email from the person who was the head of the mental health support services for the Air Force. And there's an acronym, and I can't think of the acronym right now, but these are all the folks that treat the PTSD and all the mental health issues, either psychologists, social workers, psychiatric nurse practitioners. And they sent me an email saying, we'd like you to do a training for the Air Force, all the Air Force mental health staff. And it was going to be in Florida that year. There was going to be about 300 clinicians there. And can I do a tech addiction sensitization, a training, a treatment, a training? And I said, oh, okay, what seems to be happening in the Air Force that you're asking me to do a training? And this was the part that really left me, had my jaw drop, quite honestly. I don't shock easily, but I was shocked when she responded. She said, well, we're having an epidemic of video game addiction, screen overuse, whatever you want to call it, in the Air Force specifically. And, these are young men. These airmen are essentially teenagers, 18, 19-year-olds who are coming out of video game culture. And if they don't drink or drug, because we drug test on the bases, but if you go to any military base in the country now, you're going to see gaming-addicted young men who just can't stop video gaming. And the kicker was, in the last year, we had 5 Air Force babies died in their crib due to parental neglect because their airman fathers had been on multiple day jags of gaming, and they neglected the baby in the crib, to the point that the Department of Defense had to come up with a new designation for the death certificate called death by electronic distraction. So that knocked my socks off, because at that point in 2018, I was still on television debating people whether tech addiction is a real thing. And now I had this, very impressive military mental health clinician saying, we've had 5 babies die as a result of their father's gaming addiction. And to the point where they, in all 5 cases, it was World of Warcraft. And in all 5 cases, the male airmen had their wives, were gone for the weekend, or they'd left the husband alone with the baby. And so that, to me, was, here I am trying to debate people whether this is even an addiction, and we have babies dying in the crib with airmen. And she made it a point to say, these aren't just pimply-faced 14-year-olds. These are trained military personnel. We have very low rates of child maltreatment in the armed forces. So this is an anomaly, but this is very specific to this gaming issue. So that was an eye-opener, to say the least, for me.
Yeah, heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And you touched earlier a little bit on that digital heroin, and this is what's playing in here. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by digital heroin and how that addictive process actually works?
Yeah, and I know that we're currently going through a fentanyl scourge, over 110,000 overdoses, and 80 some odd thousand of them are fentanyl or opioid based. So this is not trying to trivialize opioid addiction. This is trying to really highlight how compulsive it is from a neurological standpoint, because what changed over the last few years was we started getting brain imaging research that started really showing, if you look at it, the evidence is clear on this. If you look at the fMRI scans of an opioid addict and you look at the fMRI scans of a gaming addict, they look exactly the same in terms of the effect on the prefrontal cortex. So literally what happens in the brain is the DGM, the dense gray matter of the prefrontal cortex in the opiate addict and in the gaming addict, begins to actually literally shrink and atrophy over time. So as most of your audience knows, the prefrontal cortex is our executive functioning. That's our decision-making. That's our consequential thinking. That's the part that mediates our impulsivity. And so if nothing else, what we're doing is we're hardwiring children, adolescents, young adults to be highly impulsive, because we're compromising that part of their brain that allows them to not be impulsive. In the same way that a drug addict, the more that an addict engages in their drug of choice, the more that they essentially break that part of their brain that allows them to not be impulsive towards their addiction. So it's a double whammy. And so that brain imaging research, I think, was an eye-opener for a lot of clinicians who realized this isn't just, because I think most lay people were able to understand, if I ingest a substance, it can change my brain neurophysiologically. But they were less aware that if I engage in a visual experience, it could change my brain. But certainly we know that experiences like trauma can change the brain. So it's not really that shocking to understand that visual experiences can also shape and change the neurophysiology of the brain.
And the dopamine impact, what's happening there? Whether it's the game or whether it's social media, what is actually happening with the dopamine there?
Right. So most addiction, the main neurotransmitter, as you know, is dopamine. Dopamine is the one, so there's a part of the brain called the mesolimbic dopamine reward loop. And when we engage in pleasurable dopamine activating or dopaminergic experiences, we tend to raise dopamine levels. And so if you hit a free throw in basketball, if you eat a piece of chocolate, if you have sex, dopamine gets released. And depending on this, about a dozen etiological theories about addiction, but for a variety of reasons, there are some people that are more vulnerable to chasing those feel-good experiences. And so dopamine is the key neurotransmitter in addiction. And so what we find with things like screen experiences, and not all screen experiences are created equal, so it's like first-person shooter games and some other platforms really raise our dopamine levels significantly. And in one study that was printed in Nature magazine done by Dr. Cope, he showed that video games raise dopamine to the same extent as a sexual experience does, with the difference being, and when I give talks about this, sometimes I will say, not to be crude, but sexual experiences tend to be more time limited, more finite, unless you're Sting or some other practitioner. But I've had gamers who have gamed for 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours straight. So you're spiking dopamine and you're creating this dopamine overload, this dopamine desensitization. And so essentially you're feeding into this addictive pattern where you now need this dopamine spike to feel normal, but you're also burning out or you're desensitizing your dopamine receptors. And what that looks like in the real world for an adolescent or a young adult, if you've been so overstimulated by these hyper immersive, arousing, visual, sometimes virtual experiences, it makes everything else seem flat by comparison. The world becomes gray when you're not in those hyper immersive experiences. And so that's a significant problem.
And for the Air Force, as we were just talking, for those men who were struggling, what I'm hearing is that they were experiencing dopamine, their ability to kind of use that prefrontal cortex was compromised, and then we were seeing hours and hours of playing to the extent where children were dying.
Yeah, and with any addiction, what it does, Dr. Heyman had written for the NIH, he'd written an article that talked about addiction as a disease of now. Addiction tends to really collapse your consequential thinking. And so if you're that young father who's got the baby in the crib and you are in your addictive experience, whether you're smoking crack or playing a video game, playing in an addictive way, you are in this, I don't want to call it a Buddhist, because the Buddhists talk about being in the now, but they're now in a way that's negative. There are such blinders on that they have forgotten, or they're less aware that their baby is in the crib and it needs food or to be changed. All they care about is staying in that moment. And that's addiction.
You mentioned earlier that some people are just more vulnerable to addiction. We have some kids that can play games and turn it off, and then other kids that really, really struggle. What makes a child or teen more vulnerable to that addiction process?
Yeah, sometimes it can be a bit of Russian roulette, because I've seen some young kids or adolescents who seem like they had all the protective factors, and yet they still fell prey to gaming when they went down that rabbit hole. But we did talk, in our profession, we talk about risk and protective factors, right? Protective factors tend to be healthy supports at home and education level and intellectual capacity and resilience and some of those other things that we talk about having. I use the phrase having a healthy psychological immune system. So the healthier your psychological immune system, the more resistant you would be to, let's call them virtual toxic viruses, whether it's social media or gaming. The more vulnerable, definitely we see young people on the spectrum. Spectrum children tend to be much more vulnerable to losing themselves in deep rabbit holes because of the interpersonal social skills make them more prone towards screen experiences, and also their perseveration and hyper-focus on one particular thing can make them be more vulnerable to really losing themselves in screen experiences. If someone has underlying mood disorders, if you're underlying depression or anxiety, you can definitely self-medicate with screen experiences. So those folks will be more vulnerable, but it's a bit of the chicken or the egg, or it's a bit of that vicious cycle. I analogize it to somebody who has depression, an adult who has depression because they've lost their spouse and they're going through bereavement issues, and now they start drinking. And so now you had depression to begin with, but now you're drinking. The drinking is also depressant. The more I drink, the more depressed I get. The more depressed I get, the more I drink. That's that vicious cycle that we see a lot of time with a lot of our young people with screen time. There may be an underlying vulnerability there. They self-medicate it with the screen time, and the screen time exacerbates it, makes it worse.
It makes so much sense.